Welcome to Tell Me Your Story. New paradigms for a new world. I'm Richard Dugan, your host. And as always, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. Today's going to be a rather interesting program. We're going to talk about a lot of things that this program was not planned for, meaning that as of our conversation, the most recent historical events somehow, some way tend to parallel some of the work that my very special guest is going to share with us, among other things. We'll get to that in just a moment, but we're here giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., Wednesdays at 9 a.m., and Monday through Friday from 8 to 9 a.m., following the news right here and streaming live at richarddugan.com. Podcasting on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music. We're also on YouTube where you can watch these conversations, and I hope you will subscribe and also click notifications so when I post a new conversation, you'll be able to tune in and listen in and watch if you should choose to do so. It's 9 different programs, 9 different guests, 9 different conversations. We hope that you are entertained, inspired, maybe even educated. We could use a little real education. I'm not necessarily saying it's going to come from me, but I'd like to think my guests are going to educate you in areas that you don't normally find out about. Today, we also encourage you that if you can, support the work we're doing financially. We have a PayPal account. It's there for your security as well as ours. Just put in Richard at richarddugan.com when they ask you to whom you are sending. And also, during the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, please take the time to go within to that quiet, peaceful, calm, still place. And I got to tell you now, more than ever, you need it. And listen to that still, small voice. Find out how much time my guest spends listening to that still, small voice because of the things that she writes about. In some instances, and of course, we're talking about things that she's written about as a journalist, as an author and a co-author. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the works that she's done, including Regina of Warsaw, and it is a true story. It's a story of extraordinary bravery and survival against all odds that mirrors, interestingly enough, much of what is happening in the world today, based on the true story. And again, the title, Regina of Warsaw, Unforgettable Story of Heartbreak and Survival, by my very special guest here on the program. I'm glad that she is joining us to share her story here. And her name is Geri, and it is Geri Spieler. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
I make it a point to make sure I get my guest's name correctly. So thank you very much for being on the program. This is rather interesting. Again, without giving away the story per se, although I suppose you could connect it to the historical events that this sort of, as referenced here, mirrors. But a lot of your books do that in terms of, obviously, some of them are not fiction. Some of them are fact-based. You even wrote a book about the woman who took a shot at former President Gerald Ford, going back to the 70s. I was in my teens at the time and going, what the hell? What the hell? You know, of course, I'm saying that now, too. What the hell? So give us a little synopsis of this beautiful story, Regina of Warsaw.
Regina Anuszewicz, that was her name. It's historical fiction because I wasn't there for the conversations, but it starts in 1906. She was my grandmother. She was one of 6 children in Warsaw, Poland, and she was a translator. It was interesting. I learned that there was like a small feminist movement in the turn of the century for women who were doing work outside of the home. And she wanted to learn Russian. She certainly knew Polish, and she knew Yiddish from her grandmother. And she went to visit her sister in Bialystok in 1906. Her sister was working at one of the new textile mills. And what started off in this book was witnessing a Russian pogrom, and the pogrom is a violent raid. And we've heard about the term pogrom it's a Russian term over the years into these various Jewish communities. It was horrible. It was very violent. It was frightening. People were killed. Babies were killed. There was just a lot of violence going on. Homes were destroyed. And Regina and her sister witnessed this. Fortunately, they weren't victims of it because they saw it coming, but they witnessed it, and it set off Regina's entire being of being terrified of any violent events, certainly any violent anti-Semitism events. And that starts off and really informs us, who is this woman and why did she do what she did? So that just sets the stage for this.
So and you said this was your grandmother.
Yes.
If it hadn't been for her doing the things that she did in the story as it is related, you wouldn't be here.
No, I would not.
I have to say that I would not have married my first wife if her grandfather had not escaped Russia the night before the Bolshevik Revolution. Do you know, it's astounding to me, the events that have taken place in history that, in your case and in my case, have impacted our lives directly. And that's wild to think about. We talk about choices and knowledge of those choices to help make people's dreams come true. And a lot of times for example, the choices that you have made, interestingly enough, even in your childhood, have brought you right here talking to me.
Yes.
I didn't hear about you 40, 50 years ago.
No.
But here we are.
Yes.
I mean, it's just amazing to me when we start taking a look at some of these historical events and how important our choices are. As a journalist, I want to ask you, you're the journalist, not me. As the journalist, I want to kind of veer away just for a moment and ask you about the state of journalism, maybe globally, but more locally, nationally here in the United States. What kind of a grade would you give it today as compared to maybe when we trusted one man, Walter Cronkite, back in the 60s and early 70s, and today you don't know who to believe?
I think there's two issues going there. If I gave it a grade, it'd be C plus or a B, only because I know journalists, I know reporters. The problem we have is when a corporation owns a news outlet like Fox. I could never get a job at Fox because I wouldn't toe the party line. And that reduces the confidence. What?
I raise my hand because I would be right there with you. I couldn't either.
And having worked at mostly newspapers, and having editors that wanted to make sure that I covered everything, that I talked to 3 people before I put something in a story. So I got 3 different points of view and maybe a 4th, who really had a lot of pride in accuracy and fairness. But we don't see that as much anymore. We're seeing a lot of very pro left and right. And it makes me sad, and sometimes people might work there who want to keep it straight, but editors, may not allow that to happen. So we don't have our Walter Cronkite right now. I think that, people will say that NPR is very biased, but I think it's a little safer than some other news outlets. I know the journalists there, and they take a lot of pride in being accurate.
Well, now you're not only a journalist, you're an investigative reporter as well as an award-winning speaker. And I'm curious about this whole aspect of investigation, because where we are today, especially with social media, I I jokingly say this. It is rather funny on the one hand that I believe, I agree with what Abraham Lincoln said. And he said, don't believe anything that you read on the internet. And there are people who believe he said that. When I start reading articles, by the way, I worked, my very first radio station was a radio reading service for the blind and visually impaired back in 1979 when I was just a young whippersnapper of 19. And after working there and then moving on to a Christian station, I said, boy, if I ever buy a radio station, I want to either have it like Sun Sounds, which was the name of the station, or I want to have it a news talk and information station where we get news from no less than 10 different sources across the board. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then we would be able to make the statement that Fox lied about. We present you the information, you decide. Mm-hmm. Because it would be from places like Fox and CNN and NPR and the AP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we would let the listeners make up their own minds. Mm-hmm. And it is one of those things I find so fascinating. And I'm no investigative reporter, but I did some investigating years ago on an issue for my boss back at the Christian station. And what was so astounding was the person who had called us to gripe about an issue that I did a month-long investigation, which, by the way, to the consternation, to my boss's consternation, I provided him with way more information than he ever wanted. That people just don't think things through when they, in this case, this particular individual called to complain about a particular issue on the Christian station. When you start your investigations on whatever it happens to be, there are so many questions that must come up in your mind. Is there a particular protocol that you follow, or do you let the, as is supposed to be the case in police investigations, you let the evidence guide you?
The way, and I'm going to talk about my creative nonfiction book about Sarah Jane Moore, because that's totally nonfiction.
Yes.
And so the way you start is you start with what's called secondary information. What has already been printed about the topic? What magazines, what newspapers, what TV, what can I find on the internet about a topic? And I see what's been done, and I can take that information and those names and those events, those people, and re-interview them into getting primary information. So when I first looked at Sarah Jane Moore, everything on the internet was wrong. It was all wrong. So I spent a lot of time at the library looking up things that had not been digitized, because what happened with her was in 1975. Not everything had been digitized, but it was on microfilm or microfiche. Mm-hmm. I took down every FBI's name, every Secret Service name, every San Francisco police name. The San Francisco in the 70s had more counterintelligence informants than any place else in the country.
Wow.
We had Patty Hearst kidnapping. We had the Black Panthers. We had the Symbionese Liberation Army, drawing blank for a second. We had all of that going on in San Francisco in the 70s. And the FBI, and I can quote them because they were wonderful with me, were very generous in sharing that information. And so by getting the names, those names, I contacted them again, 25 years later, mm-hmm. and say, I'm writing a book about this. Can you talk to me? And they were thrilled to talk to me because they knew everything was not there. Now, I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I'm not, because I'm quoting the FBI case agent, Richard Vitamonte, who worked with Judge Samuel Conte on Sarah Jane Moore's hearing because she pleaded guilty. And if you plead guilty, the judge wants to know that you really know what you're doing and are you in your right mind.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Vitamonte fortunately lived in Northern California, as I do. So when he told me that I don't talk about this over the phone and I don't do email, you want to talk to me, lady, you come up to where I live. And I said, is yesterday too soon? What the government had said about Sarah Jane shooting at Ford was not all true. The reason is because Ford was safe, Betty was in recovery, and they didn't want the country to know how close we came to another assassination. Why did we come that close? They said she shot Wild. She did not shoot Wild. I got the documents. Richard Vitamonte got the documents in Washington, opened up to me, that said she missed his head by 6 inches. Why? The sight was off of the gun by 6 inches. Richard Vitamonte said she had him between the eyes, as did Judge Samuel Conte in the hearing documents. So as a journalist, it's like, you lied to us. They did.
Mm-hmm.
They lied. This book was published by Macmillan. 2 lawyers went over every single word. Mm-hmm. Of course, I kept copious notes because I wanted that rigor. No one has ever challenged me on that book, and it came out in 2009. So talking about journalism, talking about truth, sometimes we have to take a step back. I hate saying that.
Right.
It's true.
Yeah. There's a difference between the truth and truth.
Mm-hmm.
Truth is more of a, we'll call it an ethical or moral perspective, whereas the truth is what really happened. Mm-hmm. One of the analogies that I use on this program is getting people to stand on a point of a circle and take a look at what's going on in the center of the circle. Then move to another point on the circle, and then to another, and to another, and to another. When I was growing up and I was taking, in junior college, I was taking a black and white photography class. And there was a car wreck. I won't call it an accident, a car wreck at the intersection of 24th Street and Oak in Phoenix, Arizona. That's just because I remember that. And I started taking pictures, moving carefully, staying out of the crime scene area, pictures of that event, which I still have. And that's kind of what came to me. Well, when I ask people to do that in regards to what we do on this program, don't take our word for it, check it out. Do your own investigating. Just because it's said doesn't mean it's necessarily true. Now, it might be true for you, Geri, and it might be true for me, but that doesn't mean it's true for someone else. And when you get into the realms of economics, politics, religion, even education, in terms of the subjects, those subjects, everybody has their own perspective on how it should be, mm-hmm. and or what happened. The most recent event, similar to what happened to Gerald Ford, I saw the video, and I spoke with an expert in firearms who said, there is no way that was a solo event. That was contrived. That was created. It was something that was planned out ahead of time to turn out the way that it did. And based upon what we have been seeing of events, even going back 23 years, there's still questions. I have believed from the very beginning, for example, that the event in 2001, it was an inside job. It had to be because of the way that things unfolded. Now, those are my opinions. That's what I believe. That is not the truth. So the older the event, and in this case, you managed to do something going back to 75. So most of the people were still alive when you did this investigation, right?
Yeah, most
you go back much further, everybody's gone.
Yeah.
How do you research something along those lines when you can't get primary source information?
Yeah, and that would go to my new book about Regina, which is historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of reading, a lot of contacting university professors who have studied and written papers on certain events, which is one of the things, like I mentioned before, this small feminist movement in Eastern Europe at the turn of the century. Who knew?
Mm-hmm.
We never thought about it, but that's part of it. The other part that I had was finding cousins I didn't know existed in
Oh,
Warsaw
wow.
because my grandmother said everybody died in the Holocaust. Well, it turns out there were two surviving nephews. She kept it a secret, I think, in her mind because she witnessed the pogrom and she escaped Poland and when things were really building up. She was keeping them safe.
Mm.
So that helped a lot. But researching is tremendous amount of time and dedication, and reading as much as you can find out, and then talking to people, experts that may know. Professor Richard Blaubaum from West Virginia University did research on women in Poland. And that helped me a lot. Also, organizations that help people. The Catholic Charities had a lot of kitchens
Mm-hmm.
in the United States at the turn of the century to feed people because we had such a huge influx of Eastern Europeans at the turn of the century. They weren't all Jewish. There was a lot of Jewish ones because of the rise in anti-Semitism, but there's also a lot of violence. And so if you look at the flood of immigrants fleeing violence in their country at the turn of the century, it's vast. It's just vast.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that today, people fleeing violence. Venezuela,
Mm-hmm.
Mexico. People are trying to keep their family straight. Regina, my grandmother, left her family, her husband, everything she knew in life, because she said, bad things are happening here. It's going to get bad. We need to leave. And she saw the papers coming through from different languages, and nobody would listen to her.
Mm.
And like I said, had she not followed her own star, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, exactly. I don't even know in my own family's history, who averted being wiped out before they were able to continue the lineage of either the Van Haren or the Dugan families, and so forth. Well, a lot of my heritage comes from Ireland, but I also found out through DNA testing that I'm also huge part Native American, North, Central, and South Native American.
Wow.
Yeah. And the real irony is, as a kid growing up in Phoenix, surrounded by reservations, surrounded by museums with all kinds of Indian artifacts and this and that and the other, I never wanted to go there in terms of any kind of research. I didn't know anything then either, but it was like, no, 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 I have no business getting into that information. It's not mine. It's theirs. They let them be private, and that was my attitude. And now I'm going, oh, wait a minute. I'm a member of that tribe or clan or so forth. I can research this. And now I live here in Santa Barbara, California, where the Chumash Indian tribe is huge. And I've had interviews with one gentleman who is a member of the tribe. And he's basically stated to me that I and many of the others who have moved here and lived here for many years are now the new Chumash. And he went in to explain all of that. I was rather touched by that. I'm going, are you sure you really want to do that?
That's fascinating.
It really is. And then, of course, you want to know where you come from. I mean, isn't that one of our biggest questions, both as a species, but as individuals? Where do I come from? Why
Mhm.
why do I exhibit these particular personality traits? And why
Mhm.
is my nose this way and my ear this way and da 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 da. And then you start to do some research. Maybe you find some picture and go, oh, he's got my nose. Now I see where I get that kind of thing.
Yes.
It's to me fascinating. We were even watching a documentary last night on Custer's last stand. Very extensive, and to the point where the stories that were being published in the newspapers across the country at that time were all wrong, and they were intentionally wrong. They were exaggerating falsehoods, and I'm sitting here going, interesting. They didn't have the internet, and yet they were able to do this. And then, of course, you had members of the tribes who were arrested, or they were sequestered or whatever, and they were asked to do things. And this one chief, basically, since he couldn't really speak English, he drew massive sheets with images of the carnage. And that, the allegations were that Custer's son had his heart taken out and it was eaten. Didn't happen. And the list goes on of all of the accusations, but none of it was true. But and it's like, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We're still doing the same thing today.
The victors. Yeah. Who's writing the story? What do they want to say about what happened?
What is the one message that you want to get out regarding this story? And I'm going to put it in the context of your grandmother, because it is based upon her story. But again, I know it's fiction. But what is the message that you want to convey through this particular work in particular? Then I want to move on to something else as well.
I think the message is to pay attention. My grandmother and my mother said, you have to pay attention to what the government is doing. Bad things can happen. And she was willing to put her feet where her mouth was and totally believed that things were happening that were bad. She was paying attention. And I think that's an important message. She was fleeing for her life. And people have their own ideas about immigration, but our country was built on immigration to do what you think is right, to do what you think is best, even though there's going to be hardship, but to save yourself and save your family.
Yeah.
And that's what Regina did.
I find it interesting, taking your example there. People are forgetting why the Pilgrims came here in the first place, to get away from religious persecution. And what is now happening in this country is religious persecution by the very, I'll say, descendants, not necessarily blood, who are now using their religion. And I've said, they keep talking about the Muslim faith and Sharia law. I'm going, you're doing the same thing. You're using your laws. That's Sharia law too. And you're killing the spirit of this country by doing this. It's in violation. I'm not even going to go to the Constitution. It's just a violation of why we're here 200 and however many years it is later. And it's just astounding to me that people don't see that. And I mean the people who are perpetrating these particular acts. You have another book that I was fascinated by, especially considering the criticism that has been heaped upon this town, not Santa Barbara or where you're living, or maybe it is where you're living. I don't know. That it's referred to as a hellhole. Nobody wants to live there. It's just awful, blah, 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 blah. And you wrote a book about it called San Francisco, but not from that perspective.
San Francisco values.
San Francisco values, and how those values in San Francisco in particular have sort of, they have spread across the country to the East Coast even. And yet, even though the East Coast people, they have their own particular perspective on the world, and the Midwesterners and so on and so forth. Talk to us a little bit about why you felt it was important to share that, and how is it that San Francisco, of all cities on the West Coast or in general in the country, from your perspective, has that distinction of expanding those values elsewhere?
I got very upset with Bill O'Reilly when he said
Really?
San Francisco values, and Nancy Pelosi has San Francisco values, and they're terrible values. We have, we don't respect our traditions, which of course our traditions are wonderful. That we're pro all kinds of terrible things. And I said, San Francisco actually is more conservative than you think in good ways, very low out of wedlock birth rate with women, embrace our veterans. We take care. If you live in San Francisco, you get universal medical care. The education rate is very high. And that reflects the rest of the country because we respect you. We embrace who you are. You don't have to be like everybody else. You don't have to hide. And I felt that the country needed to take another look at San Francisco by the numbers and see where we stand in the rest of the United States in terms of educating, taking care of your kids, respecting each other, taking care of our veterans.
Mm-hmm.
We had a lot of bases up in San Francisco for a long time. Many of them were closed by the government, but he just, as I say, pissed me off by saying San Francisco had bad values. In fact, we have wonderful values, and we stand out in the rest of the country.
Well, that's a fact that San Francisco does stand out. And I think of one example in particular of the former mayor. And if I've got his name correctly, Harvey Milk.
Yes.
And the assassination,
yes.
if I'm correct,
yes.
of him. And I'm just sitting here and I think about this in terms of being an American, a native born American. And I'm sure as you are also a native born American,
mm-hmm.
It breaks my heart when I hear the pejorative commentaries of any group or community or city or state, or for that matter, any other country, anywhere else in the world, by people in this country, because I take a very strong view, and I'd love your comment on this. Words have power.
Mm-hmm.
And you're a journalist, you're using words all the time to describe things, events, etc., etc. And I'm sure you're very careful about the words that you use.
Yes, I try to be. I mean, one of the phrases people said, well, you tolerate other people. I said, no, we don't tolerate them. We embrace them.
Thank you.
Very different. Very different. And I interviewed a lot of people for that book who came here from other parts of the country because they were shunned or they were afraid to be who they are. Even people who wanted to be artists, a lot of the gay community as well. But it's not just the gay community. It's people who felt like they didn't quite fit in. And I'm not going to disparage Oklahoma, but I'm going to maybe use the Midwest, where they didn't feel that they could be who they are. They didn't want to embrace that. And people who came to visit who never went home because they fell in love with San Francisco. People talk about our homeless. Well, actually, Los Angeles has a larger homeless community. So does Miami. So does New York. So does Chicago. We are not the beacon of homelessness in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
It's a problem all over the world. And it's a big problem in the United States. I volunteer at a food pantry 1.5 days a week. I live in considered a wealthy community called Palo Alto, California. You know what? We have people here that are hungry. They're hungry. They don't have food. So, you have to look beyond your own fence and say, what's going on around my community? And I have an obligation to help and give back because I have a roof over my head and I'm not worried about my next meal, but my neighbor is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Geri Spieler is my guest, and we're talking about her work as a journalist, investigative reporter, among other things. She is also a wife and, well, I'll use this term euphemistically, mother of 9 chickens. We have 8. We have 8. So I could absolutely relate. Matter of fact, we adopted one who was my wife's nephew. He has chickens, and one of them was not being treated real well, and he really tried and tried and tried, but he had to segregate her. So he gave her to us, and she has imprinted on me. So every time I come into the chicken run, guess who comes popping out of the chicken coop?
Oh, how sweet.
So
Yes.
yeah, I got it. I didn't realize that I would be having children at this late age in my life. But that's okay. That's okay. It's a beautiful thing. One of the other aspects of what you do is of course, you obviously you speak to a lot of organizations and groups, as well as, I'm sure, individuals who are looking for support. And you do what I try to do, and I encourage others to do, and that is you try to give back what you can when you can. And of course, there is always that one perennial rule that says you got to take care of number one first. And that is not narcissistic or self-centered. If you don't take care of you, how can you help anybody else?
Exactly.
So how does Geri take care of Geri?
I surround myself. I have a husband, I have children, and I have grandchildren. And I am very lucky to say everybody in my family is doing well. They're doing what they want to do. They're healthy. They're happy. Those that need to be employed are employed. But I'm going to go back and how that comes about. My grandmother had 4 children, 1 boy, and then she had 3 girls. And my grandfather abandoned her when they were living in Chicago with 4 kids. And grandma said, well, if I have to be poor, I don't also need to be cold. And she got herself to Los Angeles. It's a little different being poor in LA than being poor in Chicago. My mother and her sisters were raised in an orphanage in Los Angeles, a Jewish orphanage that was taking a lot of these kids in the 30s that were streaming from Eastern Europe. Grandma couldn't afford to take care of them. And so they were raised in this wonderful orphanage where they took such good care of these kids. The director, after dinner every night, would go to each cottage and say, do you need help with your homework? And my mother said she was given so much, she had an obligation to give back. And she said to my brother and I, you have an obligation to give back. There's so much need in this world. And you don't have to worry about your meal. You don't have to worry about a home. You need to give back. And so we inherited that because of her experience. The orphanage was called Vista Del Mar. It's still in existence. It's now a home for kids at risk. But the community wanted to make sure these kids had what they needed. She said, I never knew there was a depression. This was the 30s. She said, we went to the beach. We had barbecues. We went to the movies. We never knew there was a problem. How lucky were we? And I need to pay it forward. So when I tell people my mother was raised in an orphanage, immediately they think it was something bad. But of course, it turned out to be something good.
It's interesting because my father, born in 1931, and he shared the story with me. I actually interviewed my mother and father in 2015 for this program. And he said, yeah, I grew up in the Depression, but we didn't know that's what it was, because even though it wasn't a lot, we had food on the table and we went out and played and we did this, that, and the other thing. And I remember growing up in Central Phoenix in the 60s and 70s. And I used to think, and I found out later I was wrong, I used to think that, we were lower middle class because all of the other kids' parents used to buy them whatever they wanted as far as toys were concerned. But I've since learned that we were just fine. You can put a label on it if you want, but the fact is, it wasn't a question of my parents always buying us what we wanted right away. They taught us about what it really, is that really something that you want? And if you do, then here's what you need to do to get it. I mowed lawns in the neighborhood. I was a paper boy from eighth grade through all through high school. So it's all a matter of perspective, certainly. Um, there's a line in a country song that even speaks to this, we were poor, but we didn't know it because we had everything we ever needed or wanted, and that was family and love of family, and those are the important things. And I
If your
guess that's
family's
something that's
okay.
missing.
Yeah, I've always said if the kids are okay, life is good. If the kids aren't okay, life can be it's a challenge.
Yeah,
Yeah, but the kids grew up just fine, went to college, married, we had their own kids. That is family value for us.
yeah.
And certainly, my mother was not damaged, and her sisters were not damaged in what they used to call the home.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they and she said if we had to live with her mother, she said she didn't have any money, but
Mm-hmm.
they got her a job at a bakery so she could at least have an apartment, take care of herself. And then they told the parents at this orphanage, these are still your children. You have not given up your children. Come on the weekends. Take them home for the weekend.
Yeah.
They're still yours. We're just taking care of them for you. It's just beautiful.
Sounds to me like the way a foster home ought to be.
Yeah.
I mean, we fostered kittens when we first moved to Santa Barbara. That's what we did. We moved here with 4. And when the fostering was all done, we then had 9. That's what happens.
Yeah.
But we also knew that the majority of the ones that we were fostering, we were going to be returning. And yes, it would be sad, but we also firmly believed that these kittens would find their forever home, which I'm sure they did. Just as the 5 additions to our family found a forever home with us. I wanted to touch upon something else too, in terms of, I asked you about the message of Regina from Warsaw. Is there a particular story, a particular investigation, or book that epitomizes the message of Geri Spieler? And what would that message be?
I think if I were taking it from the book, I think as a woman and looking at Regina as a woman, she went against the grain. And I've done that as well. I have not, I went through school. I worked my way through school. My parents didn't have any money. And I did what I believed was right. And I think not letting yourself get beaten down or waylaid from what you believe is true and important. And I was very politically active for many, many years. I still am, for what I think is right. And it's not always easy because a lot of people may not agree with you, but what is your truth?
Mm-hmm.
And Richard, you've done that as well. What is your truth? And that may not be easy.
Yeah.
It's easier to go along to get along, right?
Yeah.
Regina didn't do that. My mother didn't do that. I didn't do that.
Mm.
I'm speaking, of course, from a women's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Still have a long way to go.
Yeah,
But
it baffles me though when I hear the stories from women, especially from the business world, and I still don't understand it, even as a guy. And I have trained a lot of people in this business, most of them preferably women. Most of them have been women, and I prefer to train women because they get what we're doing. A guy comes in here with an ego and wants to jump in here and start doing Howard Stern from the get-go, and it's like, knock it off. But what really gets me is the disparity of income. It's like, wait a minute, you have 2 people doing exactly the same job, but One of them's getting paid less, and it just happens to be the female. They have exactly the same experience. That's why I'm a firm believer when you're applying for a job, don't put your name, put a number. So they don't know it's male or female. Then they hire you. And I think this really plays to what's really important. They hire you based upon the information you've provided, which I hope to God is accurate. And I get it so have you ever ridden a horse? No. Yes, I have. I've ridden lots of horses. You've never been on a horse in your life, but you want the job so bad you're willing to take a shot. I've heard that many, many times, especially when it comes to actors, who are going to do a part and they're going to do a Western, and they've never been on a horse, but they want the part, and so on and so forth. So they will learn. And that's great. The fortitude and so forth. You're willing to risk breaking your neck for a part. But I was born and raised in a family of 8, 4 sisters and 1 brother. And so I grew up around, 4 females who were very headstrong in their own way. They went out and did the things that they did with their lives and made incredible strides in their lives. My eldest sister, who has since passed away 2 years now, she grew up with all kinds of health issues, especially asthma. What musical instrument do you think she took up in grade school, high school, and into college? And then was second chair in the Scottsdale Symphony Orchestra? French horn. And I applaud her for doing that because it probably helped. Helped. But, I just never looked at my sisters as inferior, unless, of course, my brother and I were hassling our younger sisters. But that was just the way siblings were from time to time.
Yeah.
But I never saw that. I never felt that they deserved to be paid less just because of their sex.
Yeah.
It just didn't make sense. And it still doesn't today.
Well, people don't necessarily want to be informed because it might change, what they believe in.
Yeah.
Regina's family didn't like her bringing the notes home, the news home. She worked at this Jewish Labor Boom, which is a socialist organization in Eastern Europe at the time, and she saw the reports that would come from Russia or come from Belarus or come from Lithuania, and she would tell her parents about them, and they said, that's not appropriate to talk about at dinner. We don't need to hear that. And she said, but you do need to hear it. No, we'll talk about it later. And there's a line in my book that says later never came.
I'm
so
curious.
They didn't believe her.
Yeah. I'm curious as your upbringing philosophically, maybe even tying it into Regina, because I know most likely Poland, Catholic, most likely. I was born and raised Catholic. My father converted actually when he met my mother. She was Catholic and he converted, and so the rest of the family was raised that way. What about you and your philosophical leanings as you were raised, and where you're at today?
My mother was very active in the local Democratic Party in Southern California, in North Hollywood, and she, was politically very liberal. I was raised politically very liberal. I'm still politically very liberal because I believe in people. And so, like I said, I was active in the feminist movement in Los Angeles for a while. I really resented when I was in school, in high school, I wasn't allowed to take gymnastics because I was a girl. And so that put me way behind because I couldn't take gymnastics until I got into college. And so it informed me about equal rights and about equal pay for equal work. And I saw the discrimination that I went through working in corporate America and finding out that somebody that was hired after me and had a sort of lower level from me was making more money than I was. So there's the fight, and I fought, and my political leanings are that way. I have a very quick story. when my mother, we were growing up in North Hollywood, people went around to register people at home, and it was called precincting. And then my mother went around to register people at home. And when she knocked on somebody's door, I'm here to register you to vote. What is your party? Oh, I'm a Republican. Oh, I can only register Democrats. Someone else will be along to register you. Now, that was highly illegal, but it tells you something about my mother.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, the same kinds of things, unfortunately, are happening today. And and this is also something that is right up there, boggling my mind. How is it that we need laws telling people that they can vote? I thought, idealistically, I guess, that if you were an American, you could vote. If you were 18 or 21 or 18, whatever the age it was at the time, that you could vote. What was the big deal? And it's like, and now there are all these different rules. And believe it or not, when I voted for the first, second, third, and fourth times in my 20s, I had to show that little card that I was given when I registered that I was registered. What is the big deal? And but again, I go back to that first part of it. Why is it that there are all these rules saying you can only vote if, but I'm an American? Yeah, but you also have to do this. You got to jump through this hoop, and you got to limbo under that bar, and so on and so on. And I've honestly, I've never understood that at all. And especially when it came to the fact that when I found out in civics, oh yeah, every state gets to decide what the rules are. You have got to be kidding. What? Okay, what are your thoughts about our process today? Is it really as bad as we've heard? Or I've also heard it said that I know there have been no irregularities in any election for the last 20 years. Just using a time frame. What are your thoughts, especially as a journalist and an investigative reporter?
You mean in terms of the election that was challenged?
Well, all of the last few elections. I mean, the thing that really boggles my mind is that the 2016 was challenged. The guy won, but he still wasn't happy. And because that's a whole nother thing. But I thought, wait a minute, why aren't you challenging the states where you won? I mean, if there are irregularities, they're got to be all over the place. So I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are in that regard.
There are so many levels in place for our elections in terms of having to, count the number of votes. If I wanted to help out locally, I would have to fill out forms and probably have an FBI check or something to be part of the election team locally. And the people that work elections are very, very concerned that everything is done right. I've met these people, and they really care about making sure that everything is counted properly, that everything is stored properly. It would be a massive, massive, massive undertaking to screw up our elections.
Yeah, I would think so too.
So many people. There's so many people involved.
I mean, I can accept the influence, outside influence on the voter.
Yeah.
As to which way they will swing. I can get that. I understand. But that is not creating irregularities in the process. And that's just kind of where I'm coming from. How have your philosophical leanings, or have they? Maybe they haven't, because you're trying to stay as unbiased as possible. But how have your own philosophical leanings affected or helped you to stay down the center line when covering a story?
It's not easy sometimes.
Yeah.
I, have had assignments of things that, I wasn't crazy about. But I wanted to stand back and say, you need to do your job. And you need to talk to maybe more than 3 people.
Yeah.
A lot of people, it's funny because people think if you're from the media and I ask you a question, you're supposed to answer me. You don't have to answer me. You can slam the door in my face. There's
Hope you
no
don't.
law that says you don't have that. This is you have to talk to me.
Right. Right.
But I've covered some events that were wildfires where people were losing their animals, and it just broke my heart.
Yeah.
And it was hard to sort of, I have to stay there. I have to get the story, and these people are crying.
Yeah.
They've lost everything.
Mm.
I don't want to feel like a jerk and stick a microphone in their face and say, "How does it feel to lose your house and your horses and your dog?"
Ah. Mm.
No.
Yeah. Well, we've lived here in Southern California in the Santa Barbara area for 18 years. We've probably dealt with 15, 16 wildfires.
Mm.
And interestingly enough, only evacuated once. Managed to get all of our animals in the Volvo. I could not believe that we actually got 3 dogs. And I think at that time, 4 or 5 cats into the car. We got them to the Humane Society where they would put them up for free, which was so nice, and what have you. But it's amazing what you can accomplish when it's time to accomplish it. So
Wow.
never worry. Yeah, thankfully we at that time did not have any chickens, although we were on the verge of getting them. And then we were able to about 10 days later when we got home, we were able to get the chickens and so forth. But it was quite an experience to say the very least. And I know that up in San Francisco in that area, you had to deal with those kinds of things nearby as well. And
Yeah,
it's very unnerving to say the very least.
it's
Geri
tragic.
Spieler, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the program and for sharing your story and the work.
Thank you.
I mean, you've got so much out there. It's hard to stay focused on one particular thing, but I'm glad you're doing that because it allows us an opportunity by reading the work that you're doing to find out more about you as well as the stories that you're telling. And
Thank you so
um,
much.
and I thank you so much.
Thank you. It was
I
nice
do have
having
3
you.
final questions, however, that I do like to ask my guests at the end of every program. But
Okay.
before I do, I want to thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World, where we're giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. We are here on Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., Wednesdays at 9 a.m. for a special edition of Tell Me Your Story, and then Monday through Friday from 8 to 9 a.m. following the news, streaming live at those times at richarddugan.com with podcasts on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and we're on YouTube where you can watch these conversations. Hope you'll subscribe and click notifications so that when I post a new conversation, you will be able to tune in and listen in. And again, I hope you are entertained and inspired and educated as well. We have a lot of fun doing these programs, and I hope you folks you can get that from the conversations as well. We also ask that if you'd like to be a part of the work that we are doing here, you'd like to support us financially, we would be gratefully appreciative. We have a PayPal account, which is there for your security as well as ours. And you'll want to put in my email address, Richard@RichardDugan, when they ask you to whom are you sending this contribution? Richard@RichardDugan.com. We also ask that you take time during the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, to go within to that quiet, peaceful, calm, still place now more than ever, ladies and gentlemen, and listen to that still small voice. And with all that being said, again, our thanks to our very special guest, to our 3 questions that we ask. And the first of those is, who is Geri Spieler?
Geri Spieler is a wife and a mother and an author and a reporter, and I live in Palo Alto, California. I have a website, gerispieler.com, and it has my books on there and some background about me.
What gets you up in the morning?
Life. I embrace every day. And it's very special to me, and helping with my husband and also helping with feeding people in Palo Alto. So that also gets me up every day, and writing because I've had something to say.
Keep saying it, please. And finally, what was your best day?
I guess my firstborn child. It started there.
Started
Yes.
it all. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, again, Geri, thank you again for joining us here on Tell Me Your Story. We thank you so much. And we thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World, where we are giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. And until our next broadcast, podcast, videocast, love to Lal. Jeanette, I am still listening. Dad, continue to be happy because I am. Smokey, I'll see you on the other side. And to my dear friend Zorro, aho, aho.